I don't want to be too pretentious by saying sometimes when I'm in the presence of Elizabeth, I feel like I'm standing on holy ground. She'll be first one to correct me. The other thing about Elizabeth also is that I've introduced her on a number of stages over the years. I've known her for many years, and it's not been more than it's been more than one time that she's walked up in the middle of my introduction and said thank you and then sat me down. So I'll make it quick. But I want to say two things about Elizabeth. The first, storytelling has become a huge part of our culture. You see it now, every business, every medical field. You see it in every single field, the idea of narrative playing a significant role in how we connect with one another. I really think if you look back at history and see where some of this Renaissance began to take place, you'd see that a lot of it began in a tiny little town in Tennessee called Jonesboro, where a handful of people got together, I don't know, back in 1973? Wow. Back in 1973, and just gathered for the first ever storytelling festival that involved people from all walks of life. But that handful of folks now grew into a crowd of thousands and thousands who gather every year in Jonesboro and at festivals all over the country, many of whom have influenced every field of work in life with the power of storytelling. Elizabeth Ellis was one of those first few folks gathered back then around that small group and has ever been a part of that since then, at the heart of things. And so it's really an honor to have her here with us to share in story. Let's welcome Elizabeth Ellis. Yeah.
Last Labor Day, had a stroke. Don't get around quite as well as I did before that. One of the long-term effects is I weep easily at billboards, menus. Doesn't take a lot. So I want to begin by saying, there is the possibility that while I am telling to you, I will weep. If you have a problem with that, bite me. Just so we understand one another. I was a baby when my father died in World War II. So it was a lot like hearing that Lincoln had been shot at Ford Theater. It was something you could feel vaguely sad about. But it didn't seem to have anything much to do with me, because they were talking about a person I didn't really know. Of course, my mother didn't feel that way. As you might imagine, my mother took the whole thing personally. I don't remember my father at all, although I've strained to try to do that. But I was in the first grade by the time they had sorted out all that great madness to begin bringing bodies home that had first been buried in France. We don't do that anymore, do we? So although I don't remember my father, I remember his funeral really well. Don't you think that's strange? I remember that my father's body arrived in a coffin covered by an American flag, that it sat right in front of the fireplace in our living room, and that a man came in full dress uniform and stood at the head of my father's coffin all day in a position that I now know is called parade rest. But at the time, I had no word for it. In the middle of the afternoon, the minister from the church across the street came to call. We were surprised to see him. We didn't attend his church. On Sunday, we put on our best bib and tucker, and we got in my mother's old black Chevrolet, and we went putt-putting into town to a church of a different persuasion. But he went around, Reverend Edwards did, and he got his cake and his coffee, and he sat down. After he'd eaten his cake and slurped up some coffee, he patted the seat beside him and indicated my mother should come and sit with him, and she did. He said that he had come because it was really important that she understand how vital it was that she bring me and my brother to his Sunday school on Sunday. And that way, we could learn the right way of thinking about things. And that way, we could be baptized in the proper manner. And that way, when we died, we wouldn't go to hell like my daddy had. And that's when, for the first time all day, my mother started to cry. And that's when I spit on Reverend Edwards. There is more than one form of baptism. After I spit on him, he never won me around anymore. Go figure. Oh, I had never been to his church for a service, but I would go to his church nearly every day. You see, in the front of the church, there was a big stained glass window. I bet you've seen one like it. It was a picture of Jesus with a lamb in his arm and sheep all around his feet. I like to go and sit in the front pew and look at that window and watch the light come through and make colored patterns on the carpet and think about things I thought were important. But every once in a while, Reverend Edwards would spot me and he would throw me out of the church. After a while, I learned that if you laid down in the pew, no one would see your head or your feet, and you could stay there a long time. No one would notice you. But still, once in a while, I'd get thrown out of the church. And then he started locking all the doors and windows. I spent a miserable 3 weeks until I discovered the coal chute. For the young people among you, a coal chute is the way fuel is delivered into the basement. Got it? Okay. A little later, I'll tell you what a clothesline is, all right? Can't help it. I'm old. I pulled down the metal door and I launched myself. I found I could land on the coal, get up, brush myself off, walk upstairs, sit in the front pew, and watch the light come through the window and think about things I thought were important. But every once in a while, I'd get spotted and thrown out of the church once again. Now, the summer I turned 12, I spent the whole summer at my grandparents' in Kentucky. When we came back the day before school started, I leaped out of the back seat while the car was still moving. I was so eager to see the window. And I wanted to be able to say to my mother truthfully later, I didn't hear you. That's how much the window meant to me. 3 months without the window. It seemed like such a long time. I went running across the lawn, went to the back of the church. I pulled down the coal chute and launched myself. It only took me a moment to discover that during the summer, my body had betrayed me and that I was never going to be able to make that trip again. It only took me another minute to discover how tightly I was stuck. I was hanging there with my face down in the coal soot and my feet kicking out in the daylight, and I realized I couldn't get out without help, even if it came from Reverend Edwards. So I began to yell, and after a while I felt a pair of hands take hold of my ankles, and I braced myself for the sight of that overly red face and those distended neck veins I had come to know so well over the years. But I was out in the sunlight, blubbering and wiping coal soot. There was a man I'd never seen before. He said, "What are you doing?" It was such a reasonable question, I was sorry I didn't have a reasonable answer. He took me by the hand because I didn't stop blubbering. He took me around the edge of the church. We went in the kitchen door. It wasn't locked. He took 2 water glasses and set them down on the table. And then he went to the refrigerator. He pulled out the biggest bottle of Welch's grape juice I'd ever seen in my entire life. And he poured a big, healthy slug of grape juice into each of those glasses. And then he walked to the sink and turned on the tap. And he put the bottle underneath the water and filled the bottle up to the very point it had been before he had taken out any juice, put the cap on, gave it a shake, and put it back in the refrigerator. And I thought that anybody who would do that would like to see my window. And I told him we could go upstairs and watch the light come through the window and make colored patterns on the floor, but we'd have to be really careful, because if we weren't really quiet, Reverend Edwards would find us and throw us out. And he said, "Throw you out of the church? Why on earth would the man do a thing like that?" And I explained to him how I had spit on Reverend Edwards when I was little and why. I think he got choked on his grape juice. His face got red and his shoulders started shaking back and forth. I was worried about him. I started pounding him on the back. He said we didn't have to be quiet at all if we didn't want to be. That Reverend Edwards had gone away and that he was the new minister now. And I told him how if you laid down in the pew, nobody would see your head or your feet, and you could stay there a long time and no one would notice you. He said he thought that'd be a handy thing to know. So we took our grape juice and we went upstairs and we sat in the front pew, him on one side and me on the other. We drank our grape juice and we watched the light come through the window, make those colored patterns. And then he held the grape juice up and showed me how the light would come through it and make a tiny little pattern on the floor. And then a car pulled up out front. He laid down in the pew. So I did too. Somebody threw open the double doors and said, "Is anybody here?" We didn't say a word. And after they drove away, he laughed till the tears rolled down his cheeks. And I said I had to go home because I already knew I was in really big trouble. He said, "Come back anytime, the church won't be locked." I don't believe in locking churches. Somebody might want to get in. They might want to pray. So the next day when the school bus stopped, I didn't go to my house. I went straight to the church. I was already old enough to know that you never could tell whether or not grown-ups were telling you the truth. I got to tell you, I don't know that I've ever been as afraid in my life as I was when I put my hand on that doorknob. But it turned, and I walked in. I walked right down front, and I sat in the front pew and watched the light come through the window. I started thinking about all the things that had happened during the summer, all the changes that were going on in my life. It seemed to me like I had a lot of things to think about. I wondered where my new friend was. But in the room that had always been Reverend Edwards' study, there was a light on, and there was the sound of typing. So I knew there was a woman in there, and I didn't want to bother anybody. Every day after school, I came to the church and sat in the pew and got caught up on thinking about important things. By Friday, I was getting a little more curious. I went over to the door frame and I peeped around the edge. The room didn't look at all like it had looked when Reverend Edwards was there. Now there were bookcases from the floor to the ceiling built in on all four walls. They were filled with books and magazines and papers. There were stacks of books on the floor, and in the middle of the room, because there was no place else to put it, there was a desk. And sitting at it was my new friend, and he was typing fast. He looked up and saw me. He said, "I wondered where you'd gotten to." And when he saw the look on my face, he said, "Do you like books?" I said, "Oh, yes, sir, very much." He said, "Well, come in and look around. I bet you get a big stack of books at the public library every Saturday." I said, "No, sir. The books at the public library are only for the kids who live in the city. If you live out in the county, you can't get any of those books. I've been trying to get a book out of there since I was 6. They've never given me one." He said, "That's too bad. I bet you get a lot of books from the school library." I said, "Yes, sir." I'd read all the books in the school library by the time I was at the end of the 5th grade, so if they ever get a new one, they always give me the new one first. He said, oh, well, why don't you look at the shelves? Maybe you'll find a book you like and want to take home to read. I trust you to take care of it. I couldn't believe he would trust me that much. He barely knew me. So I went over and I began to look on the shelves. All the books were big and fat. And they all ended in the same letters, O-L-O-G-Y. But in the middle of all those O-L-O-G-Ys, there was a thin blue book. I figured that was my best shot. I took it off the shelf and walked up to his desk. I said, I'd like to take this. He said, an excellent choice. A lot of people read Soren Kierkegaard. I took that book home. It only took me a few minutes to discover that Kierkegaard and I were never going to be best friends. I put the book under my pillow and I kept it what I hoped would prove to be the right number of days, 7 exactly, and then I took it back. I was actually trembling that he would ask me what I thought of it, but he didn't. He said, are you finished with it? I said, yes. He said, well, look over there. I don't think you looked on that wall when you were here before. So I went over there and began to look. And in the middle of all of those O-L-O-G-Ys, I found a thin gray book. Stamped in purple on the front of it was the picture of a wardrobe. It looked exactly like the wardrobe across the street in my bedroom. So I took it up to his desk and I held it out and I said, I'd like to read this one, please. He said, an excellent choice. A lot of people read C.S. Lewis. So I took the book home. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And the next day I wasn't at all worried he would ask me what I thought of it. But he didn't. He said, are you finished with it? I said, yes. He said, well, keep looking. The one that comes after, it's here somewhere. I just haven't been here long enough to get my books in any kind of order. You wouldn't like to come and help me someday with that, would you? Oh, yes, sir, I'd like that very much. And so C.S. Lewis and I went steady all week that week. And when I finished the last of the Narnia books, I took home Black Beauty, and then Wind of the Willows, and then Treasure Island, and after that I forget. I was slow as a child. It took me years to realize that after the first one, all of those books had been put in the shelves for me to find. I think it was the year I got a divorce I didn't want and began to see books appearing between the O-L-O-G-Ys about being a successful single parent that the light finally began to dawn on me. A Harvard-educated theologian, an honor student of the theologian Paul Tillich at Harvard. How he got to East Tennessee to be a part of my childhood is truly a miracle, and one I give thanks for every day. So years went by would be the one still point in a turning world for me. And after he had passed over Jordan, my friend Betsy Bishop and I, who was as much a child of Dr. Crowder's as I was, decided that we had been to every place he had ever lived. Either he had taken us when we were young people, or we had taken him when he was an old man and couldn't drive anymore, except for Columbus, Mississippi. And so we decided we would make a pilgrimage to Columbus, Mississippi. We were sitting in a booth at Denny's. If you're ever out on the road and you get homesick, go to Denny's. They all look alike. You can pretend you were anywhere if you're at Denny's. Even the waitresses look alike. And Betsy held up the tourist brochure and she said, we've been to every place on this tourist brochure except their historic cemetery. And I said, well, it seems a shame to leave Columbus, Mississippi, without going to everything on their tourist brochure. They had it printed in color. So we went to the cemetery. They'd have to tell us it was a historic cemetery. We could tell it was old. We could tell it was old because it was built in the days when we made cemeteries for the dead. We don't do that anymore. If someone you care about dies and you want to put a marker on their grave, you're going to have to sink it in the ground level with the surface, so for the convenience of the person who runs the mowing machine. This cemetery was built in the days when people celebrated the dead with abandon. Everywhere you looked, there was the most amazing kind of funeral statuary I'd ever seen. Of course, there were depictions of Jesus. It was Mississippi. There were columns made of, there's a word there, chink, 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 granite. I'm working on a quiz show for senior citizens. It's going to be called I Can Tell You in a Minute. The only problem I foresee is getting sponsors for a program that's going to have to last 4 hours. Granite markers, columns, couches, drapery made of marble. Amazing. But what I thought was the most amazing were the angels. There were angels everywhere you looked. Angels of every kind. There were angels sitting and angels standing. There were angels dancing. There were angels ascending. There were angels playing the flute, playing the harp, playing the drums. Who knew that heaven had a percussion section? Betsy said, "You choose an angel to be your angel, and I'll choose an angel to be my angel." We do stuff like that all the time. I said, "Sure." And we started walking through the cemetery. I actually love to walk in cemeteries. I like to look at the stones and read the names out loud and think about the lives those people might have lived. And wonder whatever happened to all the women with names like Beulah and all the men with names like Chiselworth. Kept walking and walking. We'd walked a long way. And Betsy said, "That's my angel." It was a little angel sitting on the ground feeding a lamb. Looked just like Betsy. The angel, not the lamb. She said, "Which one's yours?" I said, "I haven't seen it yet." And we kept walking. I thought that we were coming to the very end of the cemetery when I spotted her. I'd never seen anything like her before. It was a family plot, and like a lot of Southern family plots, there was a little white picket fence around it. The family named Teasdale, like the American poet, but not her family. And there in the middle of the plot, on what might have been the mother's grave, was an angel who had thrown herself on the grave prostrate in her grief. It almost looked like her marble shoulders were shaking. I said, "That's my angel." My mother had only been dead a few weeks. Betsy said, "Looks just like you." I raised my eyes and I realized all of a sudden that we were nowhere near the end of the cemetery as I had thought. That stretching out beyond were row after row after row of graves, but they didn't look like the ones we'd already passed. No elaborate statuary. On these graves, markers exactly alike. All white marble shining in the sun. Military rows of precision marching away. Even the inscription was the same on every one. Unknown Confederate soldier, unknown Confederate soldier, unknown Confederate soldier, unknown Confederate soldier. Till they disappeared out of sight. I looked to the left. On the other side of the drive that ran through the cemetery, there were an equal number of graves. The markers different. These the traditional domed gray tombstones. But the same inscription on each of them as they marched over the brow of the hill. Unknown Union dead, unknown Union dead, unknown Union dead, unknown Union dead, till they disappeared out of sight. Just then, the cemetery caretaker came tootling up on his little 3-wheel cart, and he wanted to know if we found the grave we were looking for, because he thought that we were genealogists. And we said, no, we were just looking. We didn't need any grave in particular. We just like to go to graveyards. And he gave us such a look. And then he followed my line of sight. He said, takes your breath away, doesn't it? I said, yes. Where did they come from? He said, well, you're standing in Mississippi, but you're just 3 stops down the train track from Tennessee. People think about the blood shed at Gettysburg. They forget about Shiloh. Did you know that more men died in Shiloh in 2 days than had died in every war we had ever fought in America up to that time? I said, no, sir, I didn't. He said, I guess they buried the men with names at the first 2 stops. How many are there? I said. He said, 55 acres. 55 acres? Yes. He said, you know, people, everything has a website these days. You could go home and look up Memorial Day. Even Memorial Day has a website. Don't you think that's weird? I said, yes. He said, on the website for Memorial Day, it will tell you it was founded by some fancy Union general who decided there should be a day in honor of the men who died fighting for the Union. That was about 1868 or 69, but that wasn't really the beginning of Memorial Day. The people who live here in Columbus, Mississippi know that before the war was even over, the women of Columbus, Mississippi came to decorate the graves of the glorious Confederate dead. Nobody remembers the name of the woman who first said, but what about those poor boys over there? Their mothers are so far away. So the women of Columbus, Mississippi went back to their gardens and they began to cut more flowers. They brought them by the wagon load. They didn't stop until they had decorated every single grave. He said, don't you think it's strange that they would be willing to decorate the graves of the men who might have caused the death of their husbands and fathers and brothers and sons? That was the beginning of Memorial Day here in the United States. So this is my retirement job. It's a lot harder than I thought it would be. I can't wait every day to get home and sit down in my recliner and drink me a beer. But I always try to stay up until the news is over. Looking at the news, coming back here and looking at these graves makes me nervous. It seems like we can't even talk to one another anymore. You look at the news, you think we can't even have a civil conversation with someone who holds different ideas than we do. I come here the next morning and look at all these graves and wonder, could it ever come to that again? Could American blood ever be shed on American soil by other Americans? Could it ever come to that again? If it does, I just pray that when the war is over, someone will step forward and say again, but what about those poor boys? Their mothers are so far away. Thank you.